Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Dan and Rob Show, Sound Money, Sound Markets, and Sound Politics. We have a special guest, Nathan Lewis, who is a sound money economist. He is a fellow at the Discovery Institute. He's also the founder of the New World Economics think tanks. It's the only sound money think tank that I think I could find, and that's how we connected last year when we were starting to do lobbying. Wanted to touch base and see if he would be able to help us with some of our lobbying efforts and ideas. And then later on, or this year, he actually came out and lobbied with us in Missouri. Nathan Lewis, welcome to the Dan and Rob Show.
Hey, Daniel. It's great to see you again. I have to
Likewise,
say,
likewise.
I learned enormous about the legislative process walking the halls of the Missouri State House with you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll get into that a little later in the show. But as I said in the last episode with Patrick Kareem, we're trying to keep the same tradition that Jim started with the his show here on Citizen Sound Money. And we ask the first thing to our guest: why is sound money important?
Yes. Why is sound money important? Well, I think first we have to remind everyone what sound money is. This is kind of an old key, catchphrase, or which summarizes a lot of important ideas. Basically, sound money is stable money. We want money, ideally, and economists have talked about this for hundreds of years. We want money that's kind of is like a measuring rod, 1 foot, 1 meter. It doesn't change. If your weights and measures change, that's even in the Bible. If your weights and measures change, then it's like this makes commerce very difficult. So we want money that is ideally, theoretically, stable in value. Well, how do you do that? Well, over thousands of years, humans have figured out basically the best way to do it, not a perfect way, but the best way, which is make your money equivalent in value to gold or silver. And from the second half of the 19th century forward, it really meant gold alone. So this is a currency whose value is linked to gold. Now, this is a very common idea. Most of the countries in the world actually do not have floating currencies. They link their currencies to some other benchmark, typically the dollar or the euro. So the idea of having a currency that is fixed and stable versus some agreed upon international benchmark is still a very common idea. In the past, it used to be gold. Now it's whatever the Fed makes up as they go along. This doesn't work nearly as well. The United States had gold-based money for almost 2 centuries, 1789 to 1971. It became the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Since then, it's a country which everyone feels needed to be made great again. So part of that, having a reliable currency, stable in value.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nathan, I know your background, but the audience doesn't. What qualifies you as an economist, and why do you know about some money? Why have you hinged? Seems like your career on not just sound money, but going to Congress and testifying in Congress and doing a lot of things. You're probably one of the prominent, I think, sound money thinkers out there. So, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Well, it's very nice for you to say so. I perceived that the idea of having a gold-based dollar, if you want to call it that, has always been around, but we really lacked the kind of intellectual foundational work behind that. And and as long as it was just sort of a superstition or a rule of thumb rather than something that had the backing of volumes of research, it was never going to get anywhere. And in fact, a lot of the gold standard advocates, although they had their hearts in the right places, they kind of were spewing all kinds of spurious nonsense throughout the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s. And I felt like I had to go and build the foundation to achieve those goals. And I did so through a series of 3 books. I call it the Gold Standard Trilogy. It's available on my website at New World Economics. 2 of them are actually in free PDF format. Go there and take it. It's free. And of course, you can buy them hard copy at Amazon. And if the internet ever shuts down, you might like to have a paper copy on your shelf. It's a little wonky. It's not, they aren't particularly easy reads, but they're designed for the general public, and some people really enjoyed them. Some people wrote me letters. They say it's the best book of any type they'd ever read.
I think Brian Dorr and his brother said that to you, didn't they?
Yeah, and you tend to find out that the guys who have that reaction are all really smart. So it's very complimentary. We wrote a book recently with co-authored with Steve Forbes, Inflation, which talks about some of these ideas in a much more shorter and simpler, easier to absorb format. But where I come from is not so much the Austrian Ron Paul kind of tradition, but actually the supply side tradition, the Art Laffer kind of, Steve Moore side of things, because in the inflationary meltdown of the 1970s, where that supply side Reagan era below tax idea came out of, they also wanted to fix the inflation problem. And Reagan was always, he spent the first 60 years of his life under a gold standard during, America had that at the time. They say, Reagan understood, yeah, this is nonsense. Let's just go with what works. But that their low tax message was kind of picked up, but the stable money, sound money message was neglected. And again, I saw a need to pick up that football and take it to the end zone.
Yeah. I mean, I love talking to you about economics. I love reading your books. Your books are phenomenal.
Thank you.
I like devouring books and information about sound money and economics. And I thought the fact, one thing that we usually talk about on our shows, or just when when I'm on other shows, is just how gold and silver is stabilizing. But one thing that you really highlighted isn't just fixing the money with gold and silver, or even a gold or silver standard, but also lowering taxes and the effects of lowering taxes with sound money. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and maybe highlight and tease people about what your book contains about that.
Yeah, I wrote a book, my fourth book, called The Magic Formula. And the magic formula is just 4 words, easy to remember: low taxes, stable money. Well, if you just think about the opposite of those, high taxes and unreliable currencies that tend to collapse in value, yeah, that's bad, right? Bad for business. Well, you just take the opposite of that and you get something that's good for business. It's the simplest thing in the world, but amazing how people neglect this or pass it over or just do the exact opposite thing and expect something good's going to happen. So that's really an introductory book, a 1-volume book that a high school student or a college student could pick up and read to learn about the supply side tradition in economics, which doesn't really exist in universities. It's all, Keynesian stuff.
Yeah.
And you've heard about it. You've heard, Steve Forbes or Jack Kemp, or over the last 40 years, write an op-ed or something about it. But it's very hard to find any place where you can see things laid out in a formal presentation over hundreds of pages, and certainly nothing that has updated the basic argument from what was known in the 70s, who look at Korea or China or Singapore, these phenomenal success stories that we've had since then. But to make a long story short, we all that kind of flat tax stuff, that you fair tax for fair tax fans. That stuff, when you see what happens to countries that actually do something like that, it's not like things are 10% better or 20% better or something like that. They could be like literally 10 times better. People don't realize this. The Chinese economy in nominal US dollar terms increased by over 20 times, got over 20 times larger between 1994 and 2014, because they did the right thing.
And what was that? What would you say China did that's the right thing?
Well, for the first time since the 70s, they stabilized their currency, and their currency was actually pretty reliable in the 70s, but they had communism, so didn't work out so well. And then China always, from the Deng reforms of 1978, which transitioned to capitalism, they always had pretty low taxes. Tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, which is a pretty simple measure of these things, was consistently below 20%, even below 15%, which is something you see over and over again in these highly successful emerging market countries. So is low taxes and stable money, and it worked.
And that's crazy to think that China, which is still communist, they've taken and adopted a lot of capitalistic ideas. It's kind of crazy to think that they lowered taxes and stabilized their currency. I mean, but
yeah, we sort of associate communism or post-communist countries with high taxes, but it's not true. For a long time, China had a tax revenue GDP ratio of about 15%, which is the same pattern you see in other successful Asian countries like Malaysia or Taiwan whatever, who also became wealthy. We talk about emerging markets. Well, there's 100 countries in the world, 100 plus countries in the world that don't emerge. They just stay
Yeah.
poor forever. But there were a few success stories, and China is among them. And of course, Japan and Korea earlier, and then Korea later, Singapore. Look at what they did, right? And having low taxes is universal. Just to give an example, I was recently invited to talk about economic policy in the West African country of Guinea. Very poor place, West Africa. They're kind of throwing off the shackles of French colonialism, which are still around. And I looked at their tax system. They basically have the tax system of France. It's like, just taxes on everything, everywhere. And I tell those guys, there's no possible way you guys can have any possible good outcome when you've got these taxes. No one's ever done it
So
in the history of the world.
yeah, so you're saying, because I had an argument with modern monetary theorist recently and a Keynesian, and I was telling him that the current rate of debt to GDP in the United States is about 126. Let's just call it 130. Let's round up 130% debt to income. And the problem with that, for the audience, that the issue with that is, when China was printing currency back in the 90s, when the economy started booming, or even Russia, right? The debt to income ratio, even the United States in the 80s, was much lower. It was maybe like 20%. And what that means is, when you have a 20% debt to income ratio, for every dollar you borrow, you get 180% or 1.8 or $1.80 of economic output for GDP. When you have more debt to income, like right now in the United States, it's called 130. For every dollar we borrow, we only add 70 cents to GDP growth. So right now, China has about 250% debt to GDP, and we have about 130%. What do you in every country, every fiat country, which is every country in the world, and even Zimbabwe, there's some issues with their gold currency. They just devalued it by 40% because of economic pressures. They have a debt GDP ratio much higher. Now, something happened, I think, in the 2000s, where the UK was at 120% and they dropped below 90-80. But Europe went through a whole austerity movement in 2008, and the recession hit, right? It was the deflationary pressure. They're paying off debt, they're cutting deficits and everything, so that debt GDP ratio decreased. So if with what's going on, every country in the world right now, there are very few that are super economic powerhouses. But let's talk about the economic powerhouses: the European bloc, North America, Russia, China, all that. Their debt GDP ratio is extremely high. Every country has extreme inflation. Most countries are reporting recessions. For some reason, America hasn't officially reported it yet, but we are in a recession. How do you how do you see what's happening? And let me ask a more poignant question: what are the solutions to this problem?
Okay, well, there's a lot to respond to there.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
sorry.
very high government debt ratios these days are a major factor of our time, but worldwide, well, not quite worldwide, because there's some places with quite low debt, like Russia. I think they've about 10%, which is interesting. But it's a major factor throughout the developed world. And governments, there are examples of governments with very high debt ratios that solve the problem without fairly painlessly. And I got some examples in my book. But that's pretty rare. You got to have a government that's both virtuous and very talented. And as the United States was after World War II, as Britain was after the Napoleonic Wars, they don't devalue their currency. They pay off all their debts, and they maintain a strong economy. The pattern you see over and over again is that they have a balanced budget. They're not adding to their debt, but they don't go through great austerity. What they do is they take steps to improve the economy. Britain, with enormous debts after the wars with Napoleon, actually eliminated its income tax. They said, war's over, throwing the income tax out. No more income taxes. And the result was that GDP expanded. So your debt to GDP ratio improves, not because debt goes down, but because GDP goes up. The growth is always the solution to getting out of these problems successfully. You still have to maintain at least a balanced budget. You don't want to add to your debt, or almost balanced, 1% of GDP deficit or something like that.
Yeah.
As the U.S. had in the 50s and 60s. Um, but growth is the secret to getting out of those problems. But that's the pretty rare examples. The reason that United States and Britain were so successful, ruled the world during that era, Britain in the 19th century, U.S. in the 20th century, is because they had the most talented and the most virtuous governments around.
Interesting.
Today, there's one of the problems we have, I think, is that we all kind of sense this. We just, it's hard. If we were to get the U.S. to balance its budget today, how would we do that? Well, we'd have to reform Social Security and Medicare and the entire welfare state. Well, A, we should do that. B, nobody wants to.
Right.
So how do
Political
we do it?
suicide.
So how do we do it if we don't do that? Well, the answer is you inflate away everything. And we're already kind of doing that. One of the reasons why the debt GDP ratios haven't worsened in the last few years, even though we're running 5 to 7% of GDP deficits, the largest in peacetime ever. The reason it hasn't, debt GDP ratios haven't expanded more is because GDP has gone up, and GDP has gone up not because there's growth, but because there's inflation. And they're just inflating it moderately at this time. We kind of have this political balance where we'll put up with a little inflation rather than actually having to reform anything. That's kind of where we are. I think, I don't know how that will resolve itself. But I think it will resolve itself somehow. It's not just going to go on like this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mention cutting the income tax, because that's something that Donald Trump has floated around. Cutting the income tax, increasing tariffs, which is basically the tax policy of the United States until 1913, when the income tax was passed in the Federal Reserve. So what do you think of Trump's economic policies with tariffs and potentially cutting income taxes and so forth?
Well, there's kind of two lists of Trump's economic policy. There's the sort of practical, immediate list, which is basically just maintaining the 2017 Trump tax cut, not phasing it out. Well, that's good because we like lower taxes, but it's not actually changing anything. It's just maintaining it. And then there's a lot of talk about higher tariffs. So that's something of an increase in tax. So that combination by itself is kind of lukewarm, maybe a negative. But then there's the kind of larger things that Trump has brought up, and you've seen this burst of enthusiasm. He kind of tossed it out there, and people loved it. What if we got rid of the income tax? And this is something I've thought about a lot. What if we just got rid of it? Well, we didn't have one. It was actually, not only do we not have one because didn't feel like it, but it was actually banned in the Constitution. The Constitution says, yeah, don't do that stuff. And the Democrats party tried to implement income tax in 1894, and they did. They had the first U.S. peacetime income tax in 1895. The U.S. Senate threw it out, said, nope, Constitution says no way, dude. So it was actually unconstitutional. That's why we had a 16th Amendment. So Trump is right to think about that. Maybe we just get rid of that. But I think another very interesting thing that people don't think about much is tax. I call it tax technology. We kind of understand, we went from whale oil lamps in the 19th century to all amazing electronics today. Well, there's also been an improvement in taxes. A lot of our today's taxes, retail sales tax, 1930s, value-added tax, 1950s, payroll tax, also 1930s. Those are all new, and they're radically better tax systems than either the 19th century system of excises and tariffs or the 1913 version of income taxes. So I think that my ideal tax system of the future at the federal level, VAT only. It's very similar to the fourth flat tax, actually also very similar to the fair tax, federal sales tax proposals that were floating around. Most countries in the world have VATs. They're very successful. They work great for raising money without affecting the economy too badly. The problem is countries like France have an income tax plus a VAT, and we don't want that.
Right.
So we want to probably revoke the 16th Amendment, get rid of the income tax, but not go back to 19th century, taxes on pencils and stuff, alcohol, and tariffs, but to institute a VAT, which would probably be like a 10% rate, I think, makes sense.
What's the main difference between a VAT and a sales tax?
That's a pretty long conversation, and I go through a lot of that detail on my website. I discuss it. It's not the same. It's kind of thought to be the same, similar, but it's actually not the same. It's actually quite similar to a flat tax. You know, think of a VAT as being similar to a flat tax, which is kind of like an income tax. But what is value added? Well, value added is very simple. You take the revenues of the company and you subtract all the cash expenditures of the company, and you have the whatever's left. Well, that's called value added. And that value added can be separated in two categories: corporate profit and employee compensation. Well, if you tax VAT, value added, at 10%, and value added consists of corporate profit plus employee compensation, isn't that the same as taxing corporate profit and employee compensation at 10%? And in fact, it is. But it's also similar to taxing sales at 10%, because you are taxing your revenue at 10% minus what you paid out to other companies. Well, there's other companies, what you paid to them is their revenue. So they pay 10% on that minus what they paid to other companies. And so when you kind of like go down the chain all the way, it's also similar to a 10% sales tax. And there's a lot of reasons why it's superior to a retail sales tax, which we commonly use at state level. I could go on about that, but the idea of replacing income tax, basically the entire federal tax system, with the VAT is actually seriously discussed in top circles. Lawrence Lindsay, who was a Bush tax advisor, wrote a chapter about it in one of his books, 2013. So this is not just a goofy notion; it's something that serious tax people do discuss.
Yeah, I that's interesting. And I want to go back to something you said earlier, because it actually intrigued me. And the more we've gone in the show, the more I keep coming back to it. You said that a virtuous government, a virtuous organization, prospers. And I got my master's in government with a concentration in public administration and political theory, and a certificate in campaign management. I also went to seminary. I didn't finish it because I converted to Catholicism when I was in a Protestant seminary, but we took a lot of philosophy courses. And one thing that's always came up with Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, the ancients, even St. Thomas Aquinas and others, is the virtuous man, the virtuous state, because the state is just a representation of the soul of the man, right? So it's interesting when one, if you really want to get into Plato's Republic, what is virtue? We can get in that. I mean, not in this show, but you guys can look and research it. But it's doing good, and Aristotle even defines like the purpose of life is happiness, and doing things virtuously leads to happiness. So it's interesting when you transpose that as a personal level to the state. It's true. A virtuous state that treats their citizenry and other nations virtuously prosper. I think of old monarchs like Charlemagne. Charlemagne was one of the greatest monarchs and just monarchs in Europe. And his kingdom prospered, and Europe prospered at that time. And you think about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's favorite president. Do you know who Ronald Reagan's favorite president was?
No.
Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge. Mm-hmm.
Calvin Coolidge was a phenomenal. He I think I can't remember. I read his book. Either he had a flat tax, or it was a step system, but it was very, very small income tax, and he cut a lot of taxes, and we had the Roaring Twenties. Now that was partly due to the fact that we were fractionally reserving our gold before we reevaluated our currency with the Federal Reserve. But yeah, it's quite interesting. That the virtuous man leads to a virtuous state, which then looks at democracy. Like, right, the people that we elect is only a representation of the people in which put him there. So, what does that mean about all the corruption that's going on? And you saw that firsthand when we were lobbying in Missouri. There's just some of the corruption. Now, when I say corruption, I mean the fact that some politicians only support their own personal causes, don't care about the people or the special interest groups, other PACs that have given these politicians money. I want to know your perspective about that, how it relates to the virtuous man, the virtuous state, and what do you think about how do we get rid of this corruption and Trump's moves and his current appointments, which seems to be wanting to kill corruption and drain the swamp. I know I unloaded a lot there, but you got me thinking earlier in the show when you said that.
Yeah, I think in terms of government, virtue is actually pretty easy to understand. It's acting in for the benefit of the commonwealth, the people. The government benefits too. If your people are rich, the government is rich. If people are poor, the government's poor. I mean, look at the poorest government in the world. It's the one with the poorest country, right? Haiti, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Look at the wealthiest government in the world. What is it like? There's just plenty of money and the budget's balanced and everything's wonderful. It's the one with the wealthiest people, Singapore,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, so their interests are aligned in that sense, but and so you just do what is a good idea for the people, and that is inevitably also a good idea for the government. But then the non-virtuous ones are the things that are self-interest. There's a heck of a lot of corruption. I mean, just like money, in all levels of government in the United States. But it extends beyond that. I don't know if it was Madison, but it was said by one of the founders that the Constitution is for virtuous people. If you look at the history of all governments, not that many people are able to support such an extraordinary form of government. And part of that virtue was not cheating on elections, not that much for 150 years, right?
Yeah.
Now it's just like people just it's a food fight. It's not even an election anymore. It's just who cheats the most successfully. Well, that is not a form of government that can possibly persist, and it will collapse. And if it goes on, and it will be replaced by something else. It'll be a military dictatorship, which tends to then become a monarchy. It'll become monarchies becomes aristocracy. Aristotle wrote about this, right? Yeah, when democracies collapse, you get monarchies. So, and monarchy is, it's not necessarily a king with a fancy robe. It's an administration. There's the king, and then there's the ministers that actually run the government. So you really want that? No, you don't want that. So yeah, so one of the even when the virtue of U.S. has faded, I think somewhat, we're still somewhat virtuous. I mean, just the fact that we're sitting here talking about getting rid of the income tax, just talking about it, like just get rid of that stupid thing. Nothing but trouble. We can run everything on a VAT. Almost all the other countries use them. And businesses pay the tax, obviously, but it's very easy to calculate and relatively free of corruption. Individuals have no taxes. You're just like, not my problem. That'd be great. And the fact that we're even talking about this shows that the American people still have some of the spirit that made them the most successful and the wealthiest people of the last 200 years.
Yeah. I think the most, in my opinion, the most evil tax is the income tax. The second most evil tax is property tax. Because what you do, you work your entire life, you toil, you save, you retire, and you would think, hey, I retired, I own my land. But in reality, you don't own anything, because if you stop paying your taxes, they will come and evict you and take your land. And it is one of the most unjust taxes, I think. And I was doing a thought experiment in my head when I was driving to Tallahassee for a meeting with the Senate president. I'm like, how do we successfully get rid of property taxes and have cities and municipalities, or municipalities and counties still function? How high do we need to increase our sales taxes? And then at that point, sales tax becomes regressive for those less fortunate and the poor, right? The taxes impact the poor the most. And yeah, we can omit sales tax on necessities, food, and so forth, and only charge it on like going out in the restaurant and like tourist taxes. But like I was thinking, after we fix the monetary system and get back to a gold standard in America, what will be the next thing? This is just an idea, nothing that Citizens Without Money is going to do. But what do we focus on next? What tax can we fight? And I think the property tax needs to be the next thing if we get rid of the income tax. What are your thoughts?
Well, the property tax serves an important role, and it reflects our American form of government, right? If we didn't have municipal government, and just like the state or the central government ran everything, they shared revenue somehow, then something like a sales tax would work. But there are a lot of municipalities, a little town where people live there, but nobody buys anything there. They go the next town over to Walmart, right? So there's no sales tax revenue. So what are you going to do? Anyway, yeah, it's the property tax is subject to all kinds of not only corruption, just weird stuff. Um, Two houses almost identical value. One person's been grandfathered in, and they pay $5,000 a year in California, and the next person over there recently bought their house and they're paying $60,000 a year or something, right?
Yeah.
For the same house, similar house. So yeah, it's a problem. And part of that is, what does it pay for? A lot of it pays for educational system, which is also, the public schools are gigantically corrupt, and already we're seeing a move to just, you can't fix them. You just got to kill them. And the way that's already happening now is people going to school choice, saying, basically kind of like a voucher system. There are private schools today, very successful, very good private schools, $8,000 a year, covers everything. No endowments, no donations. That's the actual cost of education. It's like $8,000 a year, K through 8. And then the public schools at like, 30,000, 35,000. So yeah, if you kill it off, there's an enormous amount of savings to be had, and lower taxes can be one outcome of that. I think that's another thing that we're going to reform radically in this time. The public school system is actually largely also a product of that post-World War II period, because before 1940, most Americans did not have school beyond 8th grade. They say, yeah, that's enough. Go get a job.
Yeah.
Which is, maybe we like having more school, but it's just made the public school system vastly bigger as a result.
Yeah. Well, and also what came out, I mean, maybe right after World War II was fine, but after the 60s, there's a joke saying that if you can't work, teach, and you think about
administrate,
right?
Administrators of, I mean, they hired all the teachers, and now they just add administrators of teachers.
Yeah. It's extremely corrupt, the education system. The university with tenure. I mean, right now they used to have, in the 50s and 60s, they used to do a poll on teachers, and from pre-K up to 12th grade in universities, and they would ask them their political ideology and party and their beliefs. And from the 50s to about the early 80s, it was predominantly conservative. Then those 60 children started taking the place of those tenured and professors that were dying off. And the last survey I did when I was an undergrad in 1999, it was like 96% of the professorate in the United States were self-proclaimed liberals, communists, and socialists. And I bet it's still the same. We're probably even higher. We're probably closer to 99%. And it's indoctrination camps. Our whole entire education system right now, public and a lot of private schools. There's various. Patrick Henry is a good school. Hillsdale College is a good school. My alma mater, Regent University, is a great school. There's some good schools out there, but the rest of them, I mean, it's indoctrination camps. And I'm glad, like our late founder Jim Forsyth, he was the one that pushed the tax credit for schools. In Florida, Jeb Bush pushed school vouchers, which created competition between the public school systems, the private school systems. The public schools want to get money, then you better improve your education. Otherwise, we're just going to give you the taxes to families and put them in better schools. So I think that's interesting. But now, even in Missouri, there's some vouchers and school credit systems a little corrupt. But I think it's too long for this show. I mean, I could go and we can go for hours, but we're trying to keep this show like short segments so we can build an audience. And we'll definitely have you back, Nathan. I'd love to do another show, and we can get some other deeper discussions about taxation and economics. I kind of like this format too, a little more high level when it comes to economic policy, taxation, monetary policy. But yeah, before we wrap up, I wanted to know, was there anything you wanted the audience to know other than your website, which I'll pull up here in a second? Anything else you want them to know about, or you want to share?
Yeah, so there's my website, and I do a roughly weekly commentary, and I've been doing it since more than 15 years, I think. A lot of interesting stuff there. Go ahead and poke around, but go to that part of at the top says books, the books tab, at the top, the menu.
Yep.
Go to the Magic Formula, that one. Okay, that's the book you want to read. That's your first book. It's easy. It's not supposed to be a hard book, and it's pretty short, and it's free. You can download the PDF for free, put it on your iPad, read it on the train,
Right
whatever
there.
you want, or wherever you like to read. So I think that is the first place to go if you have an interest in these topics, and you should, because it's important.
And then you have a Twitter right here at NL Nathan Lewis Econ and Policy. You post regularly, I see, and please follow him. He has 1,074 followers. Let's try to get him up to 2,000 followers. And then you're also a fellow at the Discovery Institute, right? Tell us a little bit about the Discovery Institute.
Well, the Discovery Institute, they have the Wealth and Poverty Center. Wealth and Poverty refers to the book by George Gilder from about 1980, which was enormously popular and influential in promoting the Reagan era economic policies, which were very much in line with what I do. So George and I, we know each other, and he said, yeah, this guy's pretty good, so let's bring him in. So that's kind of how I became associated with the Discovery Institute.
And here's the article on your homepage here at the Discovery Institute, and it's also on Forbes magazine.
Yep, that's also at Forbes. Of course, Forbes, we co-authored a book together about inflation, so I put some stuff at the Forbes website from time to time.
All right, awesome. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Please share this video. Nathan, thank you so much for being on the show. And for those of you who haven't heard about our Pioneer membership, the Pioneer membership is $25 a year. It gives you access to a bullion aggregator. It has some of the cheapest, if not the cheapest, prices online for Canada and the United States for gold and silver coin and bars. $25 gets you access to that. You also get live updates about our legislative efforts, video updates from me, and you also get on our newsletter with what's going on with our TV show. If last episode you saw Rob, he called in from the UK. We're filming. We're going to be airing the Sound Money Movement, a Foundation of Freedom, in Q2 of 2025. So please join Citizens for Sound Money as a Pioneer member. It's $25 a year. You're supporting our cause, which is to protect people, or to promote sound money and protect people's rights to do so. That's our 501c3. We also have a 501c4. Our website should be up very soon, which is Sound Money Movement. It's an education foundation, and Nathan can help us with content for our Sound Money Academy. So support Citizens for Sound Money. Support Nathan Lewis. Buy his books. They're fantastic. You can get the free PDF, but support Nathan and buy it on Amazon. That's just my ask for everybody. So, Nathan, looking forward to having you on. Thank you for joining our advisory board. I'm really looking forward to working with you.
It's been great chatting, Daniel.
And likewise. All right, everybody. Have a great day.